Two questions from Mike Bogle, both relating to open source and Linux. I'll do them in two separate videos because I want to spend an entire separate section just on Linux distros and the issues there. The first of the main question was, what do I think of open source? Well, obviously, open source is communism. No, I'm only joking there, though one of my mates at Microsoft did joke about that with me the other day. But look, it's not that open source is so much communism, but communists support open source. And that's, I think, is a lot part of the problem with the open source movement. The people backing it scare off people, particularly in business, who may be considering using open source. It's slowly changing. I think Firefox has changed that an awful lot to say where it was 4 or 5 years ago. But there is still this reluctance out there where open source is seen as being of poor quality, of a risk in a business environment. And I think there's still a lot to do in terms of education, in terms of what open source can provide. Now, is all open source good and bad? Well, I think Firefox is obviously your best example by far. I'm not a fan of OpenOffice. I think it's really not very exciting at all as a platform. But having said that, the magic dot sign there is free, and as a free alternative, I think it does a really good job. Just that the Mac version is quite slow, and even the derivative NeoOffice, I just found it to I don't want to wait 10 seconds or something to open. But look, that's just two examples. There's heaps of examples of open source stuff. If you look in terms of backend now, Linux servers essentially are the market leader now. You've got things like MySQL running databases. There's all sorts of great examples of open source. Open source has a strong future. I think it's a positive. It's part of the movement from only commercial, where everything was paid for, to this great utopian ideal of free, which we're seeing with web services, and we're now more and more seeing it with software as well. The question, I suppose, going forward is, can people make money off it? Look, Red Hat's still going. There are other couple of companies, I think Linspire, I think they're still called that this week. Another example, I'll talk about Linux distros in another thing, but there is business models around open source as well. I think that's exciting, and the crux that open source equals communism isn't true, because you can actually build a business on top of it. Is it always for the greater good? Well, I don't think WordPress is particularly run for the greater good, but it's still a pretty good platform. But there's other examples, So it's a question of finding a balance. At the end of the day is if it benefits us and we're better for having access to things like Firefox, and open source is a good thing.